John Penrose to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered low-cost housing. It's good to have you looking after us here this morning. And can I, before I start, just say it's also good to see the departmental whip in her place this morning as a fully-fledged minister in her own right anyway. But as somebody who's a former whip myself, it's always good to see a whip being temporarily released from the office's vows of omerta and allowed to show her knowledge of the area that she covers for the whip's office anyway. Now, Mrs Gillan, housing, whether it's rent or mortgage payments, is probably the single biggest monthly bill that most of us face. And because we haven't, as a country, built enough new houses for decades, no matter who's been in government, the costs have been getting steadily steeper and steeper. The result is less living space, longer commutes, less cash left over at the end for other things at the end of each month, and overall, a lower quality of life for all of us. So, we need to increase the number of new homes that are built, and yesterday's welcome white paper contains some important steps towards that goal. Most important from my point of view were the ideas to make it easier to build up, not out, in urban areas, greater housing density in the jargon. Walk around most British town centres, and as you pass train stations or high street shops, look upwards. The chances are that what you'll see will be mostly fresh air, skyline. British towns and cities are some of the most low-rise in Europe, which, for a country which is also one of the most crowded, seems bonkers. Much of this is self-inflicted. For many Brits, taller buildings create instant mental images of 1960s brutalist concrete tower blocks on sink estates, backdrops for gritty dramas of social decay from left-wing film auteurs. But this mental trope has had some real-world consequences for the country too, because it means that we are, as a society, instinctively resistant to anyone who proposes building upwards. So, let me sing a fierce anthem of praise for taller buildings. Not necessarily brutalist tower blocks, although they have their admirers, but instead for elegant, well-proportioned apartment blocks and terraces where the design stands the test of time. Places like 4 or 5... Happily, yes.
Thank the member for giving way, and I suppose I apologise for interrupting him as he gets to the chorus of his eloquent speech. But he talks about the need to build upwards. Would he agree with me, and he's alluded to somewhat, about the sort of 60s style connotation that many people have when we're talking about building upwards, that we need to have planning forethought in terms of what this will be like in 20 or 30 years' time, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the 1950s and the 1960s.
Ms Gillan, absolutely right. I mean, it isn't... there are some people who, from a purely aesthetic point of view, love brutalist concrete architecture, rather more who dislike it quite a lot. But for most of the rest of us, one of the crucial tests is not merely the aesthetics, it's whether or not this stuff remains livable, not just in the first few years after it's built, but over many generations, and also whether or not it is something which is therefore acceptable to the rest of the community. Because it isn't just a question of what it's like to live in as a location itself, it's also, it has an impact on other people as they walk past it as well. So as I said, it depends on how the design stands the test of time, as the Honourable Gentleman was saying. Places like 4 or 5 storey Regency terraces and Victorian townhouses which people still want to live in and to walk past a century or two after they were first built. Or they're slightly taller and more modern equivalents, which provide trendy new city centre living space for young professionals, or well-designed retirement homes for older folk. We don't need to be scared of these buildings. One of the densest urban areas in Britain is Kensington and Chelsea. Hardly, Mrs Gillan, a byword for inner-city decay. And elegant continental cities like Paris and Madrid are far denser than almost anywhere in Britain too. So,
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He's giving a very powerful speech, so I was loath to interrupt him. But he mentioned the international comparisons and also Kensington and Chelsea. The thing I think he's missing is the suburbs. I represent a suburban seat where, I mean, he did say that it's the single biggest issue the single biggest bill. It's also the single biggest issue in the surgery. And I had a candidate who stood against me as a no to tall buildings person. His slogan was, "We want to be living in Acton, not in Manhattan." I wondered if he'd experienced similar things as a constituency MP, because people just don't like these. They crowd out light, and they're not in keeping with the suburban landscape.
Just to be short and not too discursive. John Penrose.
Ms McGillan, I think that what the Honourable Lady was just mentioning is a classic example of this instinctive British fear. And what I have discovered is that, in general, if people see a beautiful building, one that is well designed and which is not too enormously tall, the Manhattan example being an example of things which are incredibly tall, but moderately tall, and I'll go on to mention this in a minute, then many of those concerns are greatly reduced. The taller something is, the more impact it has for miles and miles around on everybody else as well, and therefore the greater care we have to take. But there is a middle ground here, which I will go on to talk about in a minute, which I think will provide us with a great deal of building and housing opportunity to reduce the cost of housing without having to make everywhere look like Manhattan, if I can put it that way. So, Mrs. Gillan, as I think the Honourable Lady's intervention just leads us into, I think we need to throw off these mental shackles, these 50-year-old emotional architectural scars. And I think we should number the blessings of building up, not out, instead. First. Okay, then I must make some progress, but yes, happily.
Thank you for bringing this issue. It's a very important issue for how we better utilise the space that we have. The Honourable Gentleman will be aware, as I'm sure in his constituency, as it is in mine, we have the opportunity to live above the shops. It's a special scheme that's brought in by local council and by local departments. It's a way of utilising the space that's there. Would he agree that that's one methodology when it comes to addressing the issue of low-cost housing?
Mr. Gillan, that's a very, very good example, and in fact a classic example of the kind of thing which I think we need to look at. Many British high streets are 2 stories tall, maybe 3. Not only are those upper stories likely used, and in some cases unused, but also there are 2 or 3 more stories of fresh air above them, which could be developed into housing as well. And the crucial point made yesterday in the White Paper, but more broadly accepted, I think, for years and years before that, is that the only way to bring down the overall cost of housing in this country is we've got to increase the supply. We have to make sure that more of this stuff is built. Finding those right sort of convenient locations near bits of social infrastructure and a physical infrastructure too can be crucial. I'll come on and expand on that a little more if I can in a minute, but the Honourable Gentleman has touched on a particularly good example. So, Mrs. Gillan, I was about to number the blessings of building up, not out, instead, and I shall now carry on doing so, because firstly, building up, not out, will attract much-needed new investment to regenerate and save tired or run-down town and city centres, bringing fresh life, a broader mix of businesses and longer trading hours to high streets, as the Honourable Gentleman mentioned, that are suffering already under the twin attack of out-of-town shopping centres and online retailers. Secondly, building up, not out, could help break the stranglehold of large house-building firms over the number of new homes that are built. Those firms tend to focus on larger sites, whether they are greenfield or in towns, and they rarely pick up smaller plots where an individual bungalow or a 2-storey shop could be redeveloped into 4 or even 8 smart new apartments on the same site. By releasing lots of overlooked smaller urban plots, we can create a fast-growing cadre of insurgent new developers, adding much-needed new capacity and competition to the sector and to its supply chains, and speeding up the too comfortable, cosily slow rate which the big firms currently convert their land banks and planning permissions into completed homes. Third, building up, not out, will reduce urban sprawl by cutting the pressure from builders to concrete over greenfields and green belts at the edge of towns and villages across the country. Given the strain and pressure on our green spaces, they should be our last building resort, not our first. Fourth, it will cut commuting by allowing people to live closer to work, to the shops and to other community hubs, from libraries to GP surgeries. The reductions in emissions and the effects on both our quality of life and the wider environment will be very significant indeed. And finally, building up, not out, would release huge numbers of new urban house-building sites to solve the housing shortage. As the Secretary of State said yesterday in his new White Paper, the only way to make homes more affordable for everybody is to build a lot more of them. Whether it's to rent or to buy, The basic laws of supply and demand mean that prices will never stabilise, much less fall, unless the supply of housing increases dramatically. Happily give way. Yeah.
Thank my friend for giving way and congratulating him on securing the debate. He's making some very good points and I agree with his thoughts about the welcome white paper from the government yesterday on improving housing supply. But would he also agree with me that one of the challenges is that sometimes there can be fairly entrenched local views, very well held local views, about raising concerns at a local level about higher properties and that there do need to be incentives in the system to encourage local authorities to give permission for these sorts of planning consents if we're going to overcome some of those problems?
Well, Mr Gillen, I would certainly agree with my honourable friend for two reasons. One is that for the taller buildings which excite the kind of Manhattan-ish concerns which we just heard of from the honourable lady opposite, then there clearly has to be careful consideration and community buy-in because they have such a profound and wide-scale impact on local views and on the local infrastructure. For smaller and more modest proposals, which is what I'm going to come on and talk about in a little more detail in a minute, they are much more absorbable, they are much more, they go much more with the grain of local things, and it may very well be that those smaller things don't actually need huge amounts of extra permissions or extra incentives beyond the fact that it provides an opportunity for individual landowners to make a contribution and perhaps to increase the value of their particular site as well. But I will expand on that a little more if I can in a minute, Mrs Gillen, and perhaps if my honourable friend is not completely convinced, he'll have another go later on and see. There's a further comment.
I congratulate him on obtaining this debate, and I'm glad to hear that he's talking about building up rather than out. And he will know that in the past we have built on Greenbelt, we're destroying our environment. But will he also agree that it is vital, no matter what form of building, that the infrastructure is correct, because we've faced major problems in our cities with flooding over the past number of years?
Mrs Gillen, I absolutely would agree. And one of the advantages of building up rather than out in existing urban environments is that there's an awful lot of infrastructure already in place anyway. You have less brand new infrastructure you need to construct as a result of that. Now, there are other problems which come with building in urban environments, and you may put existing infrastructure under strain and need to expand it in some way as well. But flood defence is a very good example where the effects are perfectly scalable. Once you've built a flood defence wall, you can build an awful lot more behind it. You don't have to upgrade the flood defence wall just because you've built more behind it. You may have to upgrade it when it wears out in 50 years' time. But there's a very good example which the honourable gentleman was giving. So, Mrs Gillen, as I was saying, the prices will never stabilise, still less fall, unless the supply of housing increases dramatically. Cheaper homes are one of the cheapest, simplest, most effective ways of raising living standards for everyone, and, by making our available cash go further, of improving the country's economic productivity too. In the 90s and 70s and 80s, our towns and cities were places without an economic purpose. Their industrial manufacturing centres were dead, social problems multiplied as jobs dried up, and people left in droves. But now urban living, in towns and in cities, is fashionable again, because even in our highly connected, distance-defying online world, it turns out there is huge value in people clustering together. Ideas flow more freely. Skills and knowledge, too. Firms in similar sectors create clusters which feed off their neighbours' energy, hire each other's staff, drive each other on. Building up, not out, helps these things to happen more easily, so more wealth can be created. It's greener, it's cheaper, it makes us richer, and it improves our quality of life. It's clearly an idea whose time has come. And, to its eternal credit, I think the government gets this. The new white paper has much to say about developing smaller sites with half a hectare or less, and subdividing larger ones so smaller developers can get in on the act as well. Local development orders and area-wide design codes which streamline planning permission if people want to build particular pre-approved types or styles of property in a specific area make a strong showing too. And there is a range of new permitted development rights which allow everyone from hospitals to brownfield site owners to build without all the red tape, heartache and uncertainty of getting planning permission. So, I'll happily give way again.
Thank you. I thank him for giving way. He's been very generous. I just wondered, from a design point of view, I completely get his argument, but how would he inject the affordability element into there? In London, it's been up to 80% of market rate, and the high-rise buildings in my constituency seem to be bought off-plan by people at property fairs in Singapore, by oligarchs from Russia. The lights are always off, so how would he make that link where affordability is built in?
Well, Mrs Gillen, the Honourable Lady tempts me into a slightly wider area of discussion than I was perhaps focusing on, but the point I think I would make is that my broad point, at least, is that we are not going to be able to make all housing more affordable, whether it is for those on lower incomes or middle incomes, unless we dramatically increase the supply of new homes of whatever tenure, whether it's for rent or for buying. And it's only through doing that over the longer term that we will manage to reduce the cost of housing for everybody at all income levels as well. There may be additional measures that she would like to propose, and if she would, then I'm sure she'll make some remarks later on to perhaps turbocharge some of the other opportunities for those on lower incomes as well. But I think that as a starting point and as a fundamental, we are kidding ourselves if we think that we can get away without increasing the overall level of new homes that are being created in the first place. Yeah, sure.
Thank you for giving way and congratulate him for bringing forward the debate. On a similar point, one aspect that concerns me slightly, if we look at the London model, is there not a risk that if people are allowed to build upwards, it will lead to the creation of single townhouses that become much larger? So therefore, you're maybe looking at a £500,000 house gets created rather than low-cost housing, which is actually the thrust of the argument.
Well, Mr. Gillen, I guess my response to that would be that the demand, if it is unsatisfied, in any part of the housing market, whether it's the top end or the bottom end, will spill across. So if people are looking for a particular size of house, if their family is growing and they need a 3-bedroom house as opposed to a 2-bedroom house, and they can't find one, then that demand will spill over into other areas of the housing market too. Demand will drive up price no matter what, and it will knock on through to other areas of the housing market too. So yes, he is right that there are some hotspots in the housing market, both geographically and in terms of kinds and size of house and tenures of house, where this problem is particularly acute. But I don't think we can afford to be that choosy. I think we need to build an awful lot more of all kinds if we're going to reduce the prices, and it may very well be that some of those hotspots particularly apply to those on lower incomes, and at that point, yes, we should be doing that, but it shouldn't be to the exclusion of all else. Otherwise, the knock-on effects will still be felt throughout the 10-year range. So, with that in mind, Mrs Gillen, I'd like to take up the offer in the White Paper and make a formal submission to the consultation which the Minister launched yesterday. A concrete proposal, if you'll forgive the pun, for a new permitted development right to add to the suite which the Government has already suggested. It would allow small-scale additions to town and city centre properties where the final result is still below the tree line or other buildings in the same block. Converting existing shops or offices would still require planning permission, but building new apartments within those height limits above them or above existing housing would not. It wouldn't apply to substantial new buildings and major developments, nor to listed heritage buildings or conservation zones either. So it's a safe, sensible and proportionate measure which shouldn't scare anyone, certainly those worried about Manhattan-style buildings. It offers a little piece of freedom from the cold and clammy hand of bureaucracy, a chance for every householder to help solve the nation's housing problems by extending the size and the value of their property by adding either extra bedrooms or perhaps an entire apartment on top of what's there already. An opportunity for energy and ideas to have their head without being diverted, amended or discouraged by official objections rooted in that very British fear of any building that's taller than 2 stories high. Without it, officialdom will be too slow to change. They won't be forced to look upwards and will carry on thinking the same way as they have for the last 50 years. We need change now, immediately, not sometime in the distant future, and without a shock, a stimulus, some creative development yeast. The White Paper's dough will never rise. Many valuable town and city centre sites will continue to be ignored. So this new permitted development right could be that stimulus, that little piece of freedom, a creative spark which could light the blue touch paper of Britain's stodgy, slow-paced, cosily comfortable housing market so it takes off like a rocket. It would improve our economy, it would improve our quality of life, it would make our homes more affordable, and it would reduce development pressure on greenfields and greenbelt sites too. I hope the Minister will agree.